Despite the fact that I featured far fewer vehicles in Beards and Cars during 2023, there were still many which were very memorable to me. And of course, overall, two of the most memorable experiences were actually having my girlfriend co-feature in a couple of those reviews, like the Nissan Magnite and the Toyota Corolla Quest, and that was a lot of fun. I wanted to feature her here in the opening of the video because, of course, those cars aren't necessarily going to make the top 10 list itself, so that's kind of my little shout out to her because I know she enjoyed doing those as well. In terms of the actual top 10 though, some of you who watch each individual review will already know what my number 1 is. For those who don't know, you'll see when we get there, and of course we're going to feature from number 10 and work our way up, as well as a brief reason or overarching idea of why that car made such an impression on me throughout 2023. First of all, we're kicking off pretty strong because it's the Bentley Continental Super Sports. I started the year with this one. I believe it was January 1st, in fact. This one was a long time coming. I'd featured the Flying Spur, which of course I owned. I'd reviewed the Continental Speed, which is quick but not as quick. To me, the reason why this one is on the list is because it is fantastic. It takes everything that's already good about the Continental GT, turns everything up to 11, more power, more performance, quicker acceleration, faster through corners, more powerful brakes, everything is turned up to 11 like I said. The only reason then why it is down in number 10 is simply put because I feel like this and, funnily enough, the Continental Speed both fall into a very specific no man's land, and that is because the GT3R exists, neither of them are the ultimate version, but also because the normal Continental GT exists, neither of them are the most affordable version. So for those who want affordability, you can go cheaper. For those who want faster, you can go faster. So these end up being somewhere in the middle. It's a fantastic car, but I can't quite push it up to being higher on the list because of those facts. Being 3 times the price, roughly, of a normal Continental GT, and even a good 10, 15, 20 grand more than a Speed, that's quite a lot to ask. Number 9 is a Jag. Can you even have a top 10 list on Beards and Cars without featuring a Jag of some kind? Of course, I've featured and talked about tons of Jags over the years, and in a previous year, 2020, my car of the year winner was the XFR. Fantastic car. This year, this is the XF placement. It's not an XFR, but it's almost an XFR. It's a lot rarer, way under the radar, total sleeper, and those who own these seem to really love them, and I can understand why. It's called the XF SV8, and of course you can find all of these reviews still on the channel if there's a car that catches your eye. This is the XKR 4.2 based version of the XF, predates the XFR, so of course it's not as quick, up around 385, 375 horsepower, so almost like what you'd get if you put an MG SVR kind of power plant into an understated Jag body. So it sounds great, it's got great torque, nice performance, of course nowhere near as quick as an XFR, but definitely a sleeper, a heck of a lot more affordable than the R version as well, and if you are into understated performance cars, it's a great one. Next on the list, and shockingly low compared to how high I've featured them before, the 911, which I drove this year. I've driven 4 generations of 911 so far, the 993, 996, 997.2, and this year the 991, so the newest shape that I've driven. Significantly bigger car, and you can definitely feel it. That is the key reason why it's not higher. To me, one of the prime reasons why the 911 is so good is because of its compact size. Even as a bigger driver, I love the fact that it feels so tight and maneuverable. The 997.2 being my favourite that I've ever driven in the 911 series, it's so good through corners to this day. Even though I drove it back in 2020, it's still one of my favourite handling cars I've ever been in. This just didn't leave me with that feeling. Yes, it's more expensive, faster, more powerful, more exclusive, doubtless better made in some ways, but it's so much bigger, and even though it's very, very good, I feel like it's lost a little bit of that nimble charm of some of the older 911s. Next up, one which I'm so happy to not only put on the list, but definitely put a hell of a lot higher than the last Ram that I drove, the Dodge Ram 5.7 Hemi. In particular, a 2016 shape. The last time I drove a Ram was the first time I ever drove a left-hand drive car. Things have come a long way since then in terms of mostly what I've owned in terms of left-hand drive, but it really disappointed me. The SRT10 was a bucket list vehicle for me to review, and it really did not cut it for me. Such a great engine paired with an awful diesel gearbox, rear-wheel drive with no weight over the back end, it just felt sluggish and sloppy and choppy and bloated. Then I drove this. You can switch between four-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive. The gearbox is better, the engine feels better suited, you don't have to work it as hard, and overall their values are even remaining higher in comparison to how non-performance they are. Fantastic workhorse if that's what you want it for, and cool in a similar way to the Cadillac Escalade that I bought later in the year in terms of road presence and the looks. It's great to have a Ram experience that finally lived up to what I was hoping the first one would be. Next up, we're keeping it American, we're keeping it left-hand drive, but now we're going old school, and we're going to a vehicle that I owned, the first of a couple on the list. Of course, my 1966 Ford Galaxie country sedan, who I nicknamed Beau. This one was ratted out. I since moved on from it, of course. I never regret selling my vehicles. As good as they are, I like moving on, I like trying new things. This is one of the very few that I do occasionally miss, because it was such a distinct car, with so much character, so much personality. I put a load of work into this car, adding stickers to the windows, I completely sticker bombed out under the engine bay. It was a great looking car. The problem is, it was so underpowered. It had the 289 with 200 horsepower, and it was such a slow car. It was a notably slow car. I don't mind vehicles that aren't that quick. Many of my American cars are powerful but not traditionally fast, but to me this one was pushing it a bit. 200 horses in a 17.5 foot 10-seater station wagon just wasn't enough. And even the fuel economy, although better than my others at around 14-15 to the gallon, it was better but not justifiably better to have such a small amount of power. It was a lovely car though, absolutely adored owning it while I did, and of course it's got a feature on the list. The reason why it is fairly high, up around 6th place, is because it was a lovely machine. The only downside was that it was a little underpowered. Thankfully, there are versions with bigger engines. If I'd have owned or driven one of those, it would probably feature even higher. Speaking of vehicles which I've owned though, that brings us into the top 5, because of course it had to feature a vehicle which had been on my bucket list to own for quite some time, the Cadillac Escalade. In particular, my 2011 Escalade ESV, which is of course the longer wheelbase, still has 7 seats, but the bigger boot, black on black, 6.2 V8. I'm still moving on from this vehicle, probably a bit quicker than you'd expect, because I saw another vehicle which I really like, which is totally unique, a literal custom, and hopefully sometime in the next few months I'll debut that on the channel when some paperwork for it's done. But the reason why the Escalade features relatively high on the list is because it is a very good machine in a number of ways. The only real downside for me with the Escalade is that it kind of reminds me of my time with the Jag XKR. Nothing about it that goes wrong or needs fixing or needs servicing was ever particularly big of a problem, but it was one of those vehicles that kind of had little gremlins that would pop up here and there to be a fairly constant annoyance. It would be £10 over here, £20 over there, so nothing crazy, but not really the kind of experience that leaves you with an overarching positive review. The Jag, of course, was great, much like the Cadillac, and for many people they do own these for hundreds of thousands of miles. The fact that it is me, and that I do change my cars a lot, makes it unsurprising that I would move on anyway, but yeah, it's a hell of a machine, and if it was between an Escalade and a Ram, I would still choose the Escalade again. I do really like them, and of course this was a big deal for me because as a long-time lover of Cadillac, it was finally the first time I owned one. Moving up into number 4 though, this one I feel like is probably the second biggest surprise on the list, because it's a car that I haven't really talked about that much since the review, and in terms of viewership, it has some of the worst views of the year, and I feel like that's kind of one of the reasons why it's so good. The Porsche Macan. In particular, I drove a Porsche Macan Turbo from Philip Raby. I've of course reviewed a number of Porsches with them in the past. This one really surprised me by just how good it was. That happens often enough that I shouldn't really be surprised by it anymore, but it still does, and it's always my favourite experience when it does surprise me. Much like the Panamera, which overall may well be the single most impressive car I have ever driven, period, the Macan is fantastic as well. Although I wouldn't choose one over a Panamera, it really does feel like this just ball of squat pitbull style power with a performance something akin to a 911 Carrera from a couple of generations ago, but with 4-wheel drive, great space, decent fuel economy, and their prices aren't that bad. In fact, there was only one downside from my experience with the Macan, and that is the transmission tunnel is fairly wide, which means that the footwell space isn't as ideal as I would have liked from an SUV, small or large. Aside from that though, it really is an astonishingly good bit of kit. Don't sleep on the Macan. Moving up into my top 3. These are my absolute 3 favourite standouts from the year, and of course you knew it was going to be in the top 3. the Aston Martin Rapide. Some of you might have thought this may be higher, maybe even number 2. Finally driving my favourite Aston Martin. I'd already reviewed the Aston Martin Rapide S. In fact, I drove it the same day as the Dodge Ram SRT10, and it was a fantastic experience. But even before driving the Rapide S, this was the version that I wanted most to drive, because I don't need the extra power. I don't like the updated S looks with the bigger grille as much personally anyway. I like the cleaner, classier, original lines of this model. I love the fact that the prices are lower. You still get 9/10 of the performance, which is more than enough for me, and it has more of a, I don't know, mid to late 2000s Aston Martin vibe, which to me is their most elegant of the modern era. The fact that their prices are becoming even more affordable than they were only a few years ago, to me is a testament to how much more desirable they are now than when I first fell in love with them. Finally getting to drive not only the Rapide in general, but specifically my favourite version, yeah, it was a huge highlight for me. The fact that it's not higher on the list is purely because I already knew what to expect. It was just exactly what I wanted. It's not a car that's going to necessarily blow your mind, it's just a really damn nice four-door supercar. Number 2 though, is actually another car that I owned this year. I know some of you will recognise it, and this is probably the single most beautiful car I have ever owned in terms of being a show car or a vehicle which attracts attention. Of course, Abe is badass and everyone loves him, but this one from a visual perspective is probably the only thing I've owned that could outclass even Abe. Of course, Abe's bedfellow, Mary Todd, as I called her, my 1960, so another 8 years older than Abe, Lincoln Premier Landau, aka the biggest car in the world when it was released, all 227 inches of her. Basically a 6 metre, 2.5 ton behemoth in cream with a gold roof, a fully gold interior, a beautiful heads-up display, certainly for its time, with surprisingly modern ideas like a round speedo, whereas even Abe in 68 has that more traditional American left-to-right style speedo. The gorgeous slanted headlights, which were very controversial at the time, and yet for some reason when Rolls-Royce does it, it becomes legendary. Massive boot space, just incredible visuals, and every time I would take this car to the Haynes Breakfast Club or any other car show, she looked as if I'd literally just taken her out of the museum and parked her in the car park. Absolutely stunning machine and wonderful to drive. The reason why it is so high on the list is because of one thing in particular. Not only is she incredibly elegant, magnificent to look at, great engine, in fact she pulled even better than Abe in terms of performance, but the one key thing to me which makes this such an awesome car is because Lincolns don't keep their value. Seems like a downside, but the reality is this car could outclass anything. You could park it next to a Cadillac DeVille. I don't care what it is you're next to, this would attract more attention. And yet, it's no way near the price. To me, that is such a huge advantage. Not in terms of being an investment necessarily, but if you actually want to use your beautiful classic American car, Lincolns really are the sweet spot. They have the incredible road presence, the phenomenal luxury when America was leading the world when it came to automotive stuff, and yet you don't have to pay anywhere near the prices. To me, that is a massive advantage. But of course, that brings us to number 1. Some of you already know what it's going to be because I spoiled it in its own review, something which I don't think I've ever done before, but as soon as I drove this car, and in fact, spoiler alert, as soon as I bought this car, because it is another one of my own vehicles, I knew it had to be my car of the year. Much like how the Golf R32 was a previous winner because of just how fantastic it was in such an attainable, affordable, useful everyday package, this year it is the same kind of thing. Of course, my 2003 Daihatsu Sirion Rally 2. No, this is not a joke. If you haven't watched the review, absolutely do so, because for those who do know me, especially back when the channel got started with Gran Turismo, the Daihatsu Storia Cross 4 is a legitimate bucket list car of mine. It's a totally undervalued but legendary, boring looking car that was designed for rallying and absolutely dominated it. Kind of like Japan's answer to what the Mini Cooper used to be back in the day in the rally scene. This one, although not as quick or as rare or as expensive as a Cross 4, has a lot of that same spirit. A car with unassuming numbers, 850 kilos, 115 horsepower from a twin cam 1.3, front wheel drive with a 5-speed manual, and the looks like it's straight out of a retirement home, as I said in the review, and yet Fantastic performance, 7.8 seconds to 60, blows the doors off of a Panda 100 HP or Suzuki Swift Sport, even some GTIs as well. And yet it's so affordable, has fantastic fuel economy, supremely reliable, very simple, nobody pays any attention to it, which of course I already have the link in if I want to be looked at. So this is a perfect foil to that. It's a tiny little jelly bean, it's a first for me in many ways, my first red vehicle, believe it or not, my first manual vehicle, which is well, actually it's my first manual car, I should say, because I've had manual motorcycles before, but that alone is a huge deal. The reason why it has to be my car of the year is, as I mentioned just now, it's the exact same factor as the Golf R32. The Golf was such a phenomenal car for that price bracket, for its package, for what it easily could have ended up being compared to what it actually ended up being in terms of being amazing. The Daihatsu is like that. It's not as amazing, as desirable, as good to listen to, or as quick as a Golf R32, but it's that same kind of vibe. Pure fun in a dirt cheap platform. You can literally use it every day as such a cheap daily driver, but then kick it down a gear, throw it into a corner, and destroy so-called boy racer cars in a vehicle which will put such a confused expression on everyone's face that it's just priceless. Of course, we'll have to see what 2024 holds in terms of beards and cars, and who knows, there may be a return to some beards and bikes action as well, you never know. And of course, I will enjoy seeing you back in 2024 for more reviews. What about you? Which was your favourite that I reviewed in the year? Which is the one that you would choose if you could actually own it? Let me know down below, and of course, I'll see you next time. But for now, thanks for watching.